Welcome, Anand. How are you?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here.
Awesome. For folks who are joining us today, the topic of today's webinar is Marathons, Not Sprints, Planning for Long-Term Engineering Career Growth. And I'm super excited to welcome Anand, who's had the pleasure of working with us for the last couple of years. I've had the pleasure of knowing him. And so before we get into it, I'll introduce myself and I'll pass the mic over to Anand. Folks, my name is Neeraj Srivastava. I am the head of customer success at Sendbird. Sendbird's the world's leading messaging API platform and is used by enterprises and developers around the world. And really a big pleasure to introduce Anand Gupta. I'll pass it on to you, Anand, for your intro.
Hi, yeah, glad to be here. Name's Anand. I lead product engineering at Grand Rounds. Our Grand Rounds is a company that leverages data to navigate people through healthcare. And our vision, or my personal vision, is the company ends up being like the Jarvis from the movie Iron Man, but for healthcare for everybody. Something that understands you and can guide you through your healthcare journey and get you to better medical outcomes ultimately. Prior to this, I had worked at Uber. Most recently, I was leading the new mobilities org at Uber, so things around bikes, scooters, transit, car share, things like that. And before that, I was leading parts of Driver, and before that, I was leading growth for the company. In my time at Uber, I had the pleasure of scaling products and organizations from like anywhere from like 3 to 50 to 100 people. And that was a lot of fun. Along the way, I've got to launch products in India, got to lead products launching in China, got to launch taxis in Japan. And it's just been a fun journey. And prior to that, I was at LinkedIn. I was part of the relationships team, things to do with your contact graph. If you went to the network tab on linkedin.com, that was that's what my team had owned at that time. And yeah, as part of my journey, I've had the pleasure of working at 2 pre-IPO companies, both LinkedIn and Uber. And now this is my 3rd pre-IPO company here at Grand Rounds. And I am really excited and bullish about the company here as well.
Awesome. What an exciting journey and what an exciting set of companies that you've had the pleasure of working with and leading and scaling those teams. I'm sure we'll get into some of those challenges and pleasures that you've had as you went along that journey. So once again, thank you for that background. I'd love to sort of get into just a little bit understanding of how did you get to this point in your career? What are the steps that you took as you were starting out? Because I was looking at your background. You had such an amazing engineering background, and getting into taking the steps to joining LinkedIn and joining Uber must have been some interesting decisions. So I'd love to get into the steps that you took to get to this point in your career.
Yeah, I personally feel very fortunate to where I am. I think some of this I would also attribute to luck. Like that's something that I always want to say is like out loud, like, hey, it was not, oftentimes it's not like a perfect path. But one of the things that's truly helped me is having the right mentors along my career journey. And it started off from when I first started my job at LinkedIn. I had a fantastic manager and a great product manager, both of whom were looking out for me and who were there to sort of like help me, guide me, coach me through it. Same thing that happened at Uber. And one of the things I realized is a few things. The first is having an understanding of where I wanted to go. Early on, like even after right after college, you're excited. You're like, I could change the world and it's going to be awesome. And then you will get the question that I still get to this day. It's like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And frankly, at that time, one of the things that I was always excited or gravitated toward was engineering leadership. And initially, I also thought about, do I want to be a product manager or not? But ultimately, when I thought about what it means to be an engineering leader versus what it means to be a product manager, I liked the idea of building, and therefore being an engineering leader was something that appealed to me. And so for me, even early on, I knew that I want to get into engineering management and eventually one day be like the head of engineering for a public company. And then you start working backwards from there and you go, okay, cool. Like in order for me to get to that spot, what do I need? Well, I need to first be an engineering manager and be a really good one. Before that, I need to make it to a senior engineer. And like, so having a sense of what that looked like and being able to work backwards was super helpful. Once I knew that, then I needed to make sure I set myself up in places that I can go and get that opportunity to learn and have the right mentor or manager for doing so. The choice to join LinkedIn, as much as I want to say like, oh, it was super well thought through, it was a little bit of a guess. And the guess for me here was along the lines of, hey, I could go join an amazing established company that is public and things like that. But, I'm early, I'm still young. Like, let me go try joining a pre-IPO company. The truth is at that time, right, like there's hundreds of pre-IPO companies. And if I think back at it, like companies that I was talking to, some companies have not been around. Some companies are like actually did have phenomenal exits. LinkedIn also had a great exit, but like it felt more random. And so there, what I was looking for was which company did I believe had the best chance of being successful. And literally at that time, I was like, LinkedIn seems cool. This seems like a fun spot. And then I went with that. The next spot with Uber, on the other hand, was slightly different. This time around, it was actually I knew what I was looking for. And by the way, as I talk about this, I'm actually reminded of Mark Andreessen's 4 kinds of luck. And so maybe I'll go a quick tangent, but I'll come back to it. I apologize, but like I think it's worth it. The 4 kinds of luck is actually an incredible thing. Where the first kind of luck is blind luck. You literally walk down the street, bought a lottery ticket, boom, you won the lottery. That's blind luck, and that's awesome. And in some ways, you can make an argument, or I could make an argument that joining LinkedIn was blind luck for me. I was looking to join a pre-IPO company. I didn't know how to effectively evaluate those companies. LinkedIn seemed like a fun spot. It was doing amazing things. I like the people. I like the team. Perfect. I go join there. The second kind of luck is you put yourself in positions where you could be lucky. As an example, you buy lottery tickets every day. So theoretically, yes, you got lucky, but you are putting yourself in those positions to be luckier. For me, that was Uber. The things that I was looking for in Uber was a company that's going through hypergrowth, a company that has a lot of competition. Because again, that for me, I believe, is competition breeds innovation. And therefore, I wanted to work in a company that's going to be incredibly innovative to do this. I also wanted to be on the bleeding edge of this, and which is why I wanted to work on growth. I got to see the company go from like less than 1 billion rides to over 4 to 5 billion. I joined the company when it was less than 200 engineers. I saw that by the time I was leaving, it was 6,000 engineers. And so that was kind of like, I want to put myself in that spot because I'm going to learn, I'm going to go through that. The third kind of luck is where you actually have a pretty good idea of what actually success could look like. And so you're not just throwing darts. So if I were to go with my lottery ticket example, like you have some magical understanding of how numbers and probabilities work, and you're able to predict that 14 and 15 show up more often than lottery winning, so you pick those. So it doesn't mean you're going to be right all the time, but you have understood what is necessary to be successful, and you can start saying, is like, this thing is going to be great for me. For me, that was Grand Rounds. In Grand Rounds' case, one of the things that I was looking for, again, on my journey to be the head of engineering for a company, was along the lines of thinking about, okay, what creates success? Theoretically, having grown organizations at Uber, I had opportunities to pursue opportunities to be head of engineering at that time. But again, it's a matter of like fancy shiny title today, or what's going to help me be successful later. So sometimes it feels like a little bit like delayed gratification, but it was an intentional one. And things that I thought would be incredibly valuable would be working at a company that is going to be disrupting an industry, being early at that company where that company's success I can causally influence that, working with leaders who I truly believe are going to be a strong, believable source or coach for me to help be successful, and also working on a product that I feel personally excited and passionate about. And that for me ended up being Grand Rounds. Now, the fourth kind of luck, which I think is the coolest luck, is where luck chases you. You are so frigging good that people will say, I must bring this person here. And I think about that in terms of folks like Eric Schmidt, Sheryl Sandberg. They were, you can say, wow, they got lucky when they joined Google or Facebook, but they were incredibly successful prior to. And so honestly, that's the luck I want to get to, is where I want to be so friggin' good that everybody is like, oh my gosh, I got to have Anand here because Anand's going to be amazing. And so that's really how I've thought about my own personal career journey. And that's why, again, I'm really excited about Grand Rounds, because I feel like in doing so, and if I do my job well here, I would have learned stuff and I've created an impact that enables me to get to that fourth kind of luck, which I think would be the coolest one.
That's amazing. I think I love the mentions of, first of all, the 4 kinds of luck was something that I had read about, but I had not had someone explain to me the way in which you're explaining. So that's awesome. Love the fact that you were looking for opportunities where you were going to have fun, because at the end of the day, when you're actually building something, you want to have fun with the teams you're working with, the products you're working with, and also the impact that it's having. So the focus on growth, fun, and also how you got along the journey was super interesting. One thing I want to dig in a little bit more, because I think you mentioned this along the way, that as you're growing and as you're growing in your career, as you're growing the teams, you have to really rely on mentors or managers or people who you can look up to, who can guide you in your career. And so I'd love to hear from you some thoughts on leadership and mentorship, which is how important it is in a manager's role to guide people in their careers. And what do you do currently to help your individual team members grow? Maybe if you can give me some examples on Uber or LinkedIn, how your manager over there was able to go and help you grow, and that you were able to go and apply to the next level, and how you're doing it today.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, part of it is like, oftentimes I think about why we or I got into management in the first place, right? You're like, oh, I want to do this because I can have a greater impact. I can coach people. I can help people do better in their job. And that sometimes is super true, right? Like, I actually feel like I think a manager plays a huge part in that. Now, the other side of this is, I've also seen it, is like, what I see is like, you get kind of stuck in a spot, or you're doing some things and you go, man, my manager sucks. I am not growing as much because my manager's not helping out. And so it's kind of like, you have to think about, how do you grow, right? Like, ultimately, the question for each one of us is, we grow and learn in different ways. There are some folks who love by reading. There are some folks who love by taking notes on stuff. And like, other folks are like, no, I just want to do it. Like, throw me in the deep end. I'm going to figure it out and I'm going to learn. Wade Chambers, who's my boss and CTO, like he has this thing where he asks, like, do you know how to brew beer? And the honest answer is no, I don't know how to brew beer. But if I had to learn how to brew beer, I could, right? Like, I can watch YouTube videos and I can figure it out. And so I was like, give me enough time and I'll figure out how to brew beer. But then the question is, can you brew good beer? And I'm like, oh, that's a completely different thing. Like, there will be beer. I don't know if it'll be any good or not. So how can you get there? It's like, well, if I keep practicing and stuff like that, but like, at some point I would need help, right? And what would help, what would accelerate that help would be like, hey, if someone who knew how to brew beer is like, Anand, like, I actually have no idea how to brew beer, so I don't even know what the steps are, but like, you've let this ferment for too long, or like, you need to clean the bowls or containers properly or something like that, or you need to use a different kind of yeast. Having that believable source can be the fulcrum, can be the accelerator of your career in that regard. And that's what I think about when I think about it in the context of the role of a manager. The manager is going to be your guide. They're going to be a mentor. They're going to be a coach, but they're not your 90%. Like, you cannot say, oh man, like, I was here, I need to get to the next level. 90% of the work needs to be done by the manager. My personal view is that there's going to be a set of declarative knowledge, like knowledge that you can either read from a book or you just learn over time. Like, don't do this. This is how you should do it. And I think for me, that's like 20 to 30%. Your manager or leader, depending on the topic, is probably another 20 to 30% who can sort of like accelerate that in a meaningful way, but it's a meaningful percentage. And the rest is actually doing things on your own and trying that out and seeing like, I did this, oh, that was great. Or no, I didn't do this, that was terrible. And like, you learn. And for me, what I think about is putting yourself in positions, putting yourself in roles where you get to practice those things. Another person who I respect tremendously, he mentioned this to me. What he said was something like, look, if you want to be a master electrician, go work with a master electrician. Don't go work with a master plumber. They all work in the same home. And honestly, like, they add a significant amount of value, but but they're going to teach you very different things. If you try to learn how to be an electrician from a plumber, you're going to not learn what you need to learn in a meaningful way. And so it's finding the right mentor or coach who can guide you in that journey. As I look back at my career, the things that for me that stood out was at an Uber, I had a manager, his name is Ganesh. He actually went out of his way to give me opportunities. And he sort of like again, I think of this as like giving the opportunities to grow, giving the opportunities to practice the things. One of the aspects that I've seen with managers, and I also fit in that bucket too, was like at some point or another, you try to measure your growth, and the way you measure your growth is by saying, oh, how many people are on my team? Because, you know, bigger team, bigger impact, therefore I'm awesome. But the reality is, I think we're looking at it backwards. We look at it backwards in terms of the number of reports I have, therefore I can have the largest impact. But what you really care about is, can you have the largest impact? It doesn't matter if you have 1-person team that's having a massive impact, or if you have a 100-person team that's having no impact. Like, that's actually sub-ideal. And so I think for me, one of the things was Ganesh helped me focus on that a lot more. And this is because, again, you go through your early management journey, and what you see around you is your peers who are growing in their career. And like oftentimes as a manager, you go, cool, my next job is to be a second-line manager. In order to be a second-line manager, I need to have a large enough team. Therefore, let me go figure this out. That's actually not the right way to think about this. The right way to think about this is, how can you get really good at driving impact? And if you can drive amazing impact, what's the right team? Like, what's the right folks? And who do you bring along with you? And if you continually drive impact, the organization it's in the interest of the organization to give you more responsibility. Because the more responsibility, because if you're really good at what you do, of course, as a company, you want to give you more. Like, I think there's a famous saying, right? Like, reward of good work is more work. And that really shows up here over and over again. So at a LinkedIn for me, honestly, I think that was when I learned how to be a manager. So there's so many things I can talk about, but those were in many ways, like for many folks here who'd be like, dude, Anand, if you didn't know how to do this, like, what are you crazy? But there was lots of lessons along the way, right? Like one of the things that Wade helped me see or talk about, and we talk about this quite a lot, is the notion of being effective versus efficient. Where as a manager, you can be effective in a situation, or you can be efficient. The efficient solution might be like, hey, you guys are doing it the wrong way, let's change it over. An effective solution is you sort of help them see that problem and work through that. As an engineer early in my career, I was always the more efficient person. I'd be like, yes, let's go solve this. Like, I know how to do this, why don't you go do this? The earlier managers at LinkedIn sort of helped me understand, like, you don't want to be efficient all the time. You sometimes have to be effective. And like, what are the right questions? How do you guide someone through this? And again, I say this out loud, not to say is like, the reason I say this out loud is because I think it's a very important skill as a manager, and sometimes you don't see it at that time. And for me, I had good mentors who sort of guided me through that. Since then, now I've started to formulate what that translates to, right? And then like, that's sort of like, what are the principles underneath that? And it's like, you understand the what you have to do. And I think I got to apply it in a very deep and meaningful way. At Grand Rounds, I'm learning the why. Why is this important? Why do you do it this way? Like, if you had to start from first principles and break it all apart, what would you do differently? And I think that's been also a fun journey for me personally along the way as well.
Awesome. First of all, I really love some of the examples you gave, some of the focus on ensuring that you're focusing on not just making sure that you're growing your career and you're basically working with your manager. That 20 to 30% was an interesting anecdote, because at the end of the day, when you're working with your team, the team's actually, the individual engineer or the individual who's working with the manager is really responsible for their own growth. The manager is just the navigation system on how to get there. It's basically you have to chart out the path on how to go and get there. And efficient versus effective was another interesting thing, because at the end of the day, the engineers are super, super smart folks, and they'll be like, why do I need a manager to be guiding where I need to go? But the truth is, as an engineer, I also need to go and solve the biggest and best problems out there. If I have to solve them in the most efficient and time-sensitive way, sure, it'll be interesting. But is it having an effective impact? Is it having that sort of thing that I think is going to make a difference? And so the examples you gave are pretty interesting and pretty relevant, because as you see, most of the companies that are sort of going and solving those problems, like Grand Rounds is solving the problems for patients and how to use data, and the kind of issues and challenges that engineers may have seen in different roles in the past are very different from perhaps what you're seeing here. Like some of the interesting, tips and tricks that you learn in one job versus the other are super interesting. So I'd love to see what, as an engineering leader, what are the competitive advantages that you would have coming from such a diverse set of experiences, which I personally don't know of too many people who've had that level of, Uber and LinkedIn and now, hyper growth companies and now coming at grand rounds. What competitive advantages do you have as a leader, and what advice do you have for other engineers who can build their skill sets? Because at the end of the day, it's all about skill building and building that muscle to get to the next level and solving the next set of problems.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I can tell you about all the things I've done wrong. And like that in itself is a competitive advantage of all the mistakes and being able to say, yeah, I did that wrong. I will never do this again. I am sorry. But beyond that, I think your point about competitive advantage is actually very true. The thing that I think this stuck with me quite a bit when I was actually trying to think about my next role is the thing is like, if you work at a company that's doing incredibly well, you can say, oh, I did this, but like, it's not really true, right? Like I can claim like, look, I made Uber super successful, but that's not true, right? Like Uber was incredibly successful, even like, or you could see the path for the company being successful when I joined. You could like, Uber had amazing vision, amazing talent. And like, there's so many people around you who were awesome in doing so. And so in many ways, I feel like I contributed to the success, but I cannot take full credit for it in any way whatsoever.
Of course
but the thing was like, okay, what is my competitive advantage, right? Like if I were to go out and say, hey, I'm leaving Uber, what are the things that I can say? Like, look, I've seen and built organizations through hypergrowth. I have seen the organization go through a lot of, I wouldn't say churn's the wrong term, but like a lot of negative news, right? Like if you think about the leaks, the Slack, like the CEO change, like I've seen a lot of those things. I've also seen building products in a hyper competitive space. I've seen launching new products. And like one of the things I loved about Uber was the fact of how quickly the company moved, where you like the amount of learning you go through in a hyper growth company is amazing in the sense that you may say, oh, like I'm building a system that's going to handle 10x scale. Well, but like the truth is you're going to hit 10x scale in 6 months. So now all of a sudden you have to think about it in a very different way where you can't just say, oh, it's going to take me 3 months to build and all of a sudden it's going to fall over 6 months later. No, you need to actually have a very fundamentally different way of approaching those things. So I think those are some of the advantages. The true advantage that I'm really going for personally is I want to play a meaningful part at a company where I can look back and be able to say is like, I added value in these 5 or 6 areas. And I did that before people thought it was cool in many ways, not to sound like a hipster. But like I think about that in terms of like even working at Grand Rounds, right? Like Grand Rounds, one, I think this company is on an amazing mission. Like one of the things I often think about is if I'm introducing myself at a company all hands saying, hey, I'm your new head of engineering, like, cool. Like, I want to be proud. Like, I actually genuinely want to be proud about the work I've done. Like, I don't want to be like saying, oh, I worked in this and yeah, let's ignore this part of my career. Like, no, like I want to be proud of the things I've done. I want to be able to say is like looking back and say, hey, I did this. This was amazing. This part was amazing. So that's one part of it. The second part is I want to understand the principles. Like, it's not just about like, I mean, things I think about in this regards, like, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to do a one-on-one? Like, why do a one-on-one? Like, we do one-on-ones as managers and ICs all the time. And like, there's no course, right? Like, there's not a course that you take in business. Actually, I've not gone through business school, but I don't know if there's a course about how to do one-on-ones effectively. But what is the purpose of it? Why are you doing this? And what are the principles about a lot of the decisions you're making? And that was something that I was actively looking for. One of the things was that when I joined both Uber and LinkedIn, those companies had a lot of things figured out in some ways. And again, there's a lot of things they had to figure out along the journey too, so it's not perfectly defined. But there's a lot of things that they were like, oh, like, here's our engineering ladder. Here's how we do levels. Here's how we do these things. Here's how we do promotions. I wanted to play a part in understanding why. I wanted to figure out why we do these things, how we do them, and how can I change and influence them? Because again, if I want to be the head of engineering one day, I need to have my view on it. Not that I'm saying my view is right or wrong, but I have to be able to justify and explain it to my organization in a way that is not like, yeah, I guess, like, you know, I do it because I said so, but like, no, I want my team and people to ask me questions, and I want people to push back, and I need to have strong principles by which I can answer those things. So I think that's been the thing for me in terms of advantage or what have you. The question you also asked is like what advice I would have for the engineer or anyone is like, the honest thing is like oftentimes understanding what you want is super important. The thing that you see, and one of the, I mean, we're hiring like crazy, so I do a lot of interviews. What I've found is when you talk to people, what's next for you? What do you want to do? Or how do you pick your new job? It's usually one of three things that people look at. One is comfort. Like, oh, I know this person at this company and they've referred me in, like, it's going to be great. I know them, they'll be there for me. Competence, like, oh my gosh, like like they do Java, I do Java, I'm going to be really great at it. Oh, they've been doing this stuff in X and I'm really good at X, so this will be fun for me. Or extrinsics like, oh, this company is going to look great on my resume. Oh, they're giving me a really good title. Or actually, you know what, they're paying me a massive amount of money. Or, you know, like, they are saying I get to work on machine learning. That's going to look great on my resume. Therefore, I'm going to do machine learning. So those are, by the way, totally valid and legitimate reasons. Like, I'm actually not trying to say, hey, like, don't do that. Like, oftentimes I've worked with people I've worked with before, but that is very different from having a set of principles by which you'll decide your next career. If, for example, you've thought about this and said is like, look, the thing that I want to do is be the best machine learning engineer out there. That you may pick a company which doesn't have the fancy comp, doesn't have the fancy name. It may just have the best machine learning engine manager that you could work with, and you consciously choose to go work with them. And like, that's a very different call. And I think about this even in the sense of like, if Jeff Bezos, now that he's retiring from Amazon, ever messages me and goes, hey, Anand, you want to go, I'm going to teach you all the things that are necessary to build an amazing organization. You want to work with me? I'm not going to be like, oh, Jeff, what's my title going to be? Or what's my comp going to be? I'll be like, oh yeah, like that sounds amazing. Like that's incredible. And that's what I think about in the context here as well. It's like, think about what is actually important to you. And by the way, the choice could be is like, look, the thing I want to do is I want to start my own startup. And for that, I need a massive amount of cash. And therefore, the thing I'm going to prioritize is a company that's going to pay me a lot of compensation. Perfectly legitimate. And that makes complete sense. But that's, again, a very deliberate choice you're making in your career as you go through that. And so it's important to think about what is it that truly matters. And again, you may set boundaries, right? You can't say, like, hey, look, I want to learn these things, but I got to get paid X amount. But those are things, if you have a sense of what are the things you're willing to trade off on? What are things you're willing to compromise on? That's going to be very different. For me, I continually have optimized for growth. I have constantly taken pay cuts. When I joined Uber, I took a pay cut. When I joined Grand Rounds, I took a pay cut. In the long term, it's paid for itself. It's paid for itself. Joining, again, LinkedIn was not like, at that time, LinkedIn was much more on the equity side. It paid off really well for me. And so again, if I'm optimizing for long-term growth, both financial and personal, it's worked out. Now, there's a good chance it may not have, and I would not have regretted it because I was optimizing for growth. So if like Uber, let's say, failed miserably, I would have still learned so many things along the way that it would have been fine. So that would be my nudge, is like, think about what is it that you want to do? And if you don't know what you want to do, think about what that could look like, right? Like maybe the answer is like, look, I don't know what I want to do in 10 years, but what's my next job after this one, right? Like, let's take, for example, and not your job, like with the one you're in, but let's take, for example, you take whatever next job and you're about to apply for a job 4 years from now. What would be that job that you'd apply to? What is the thing that you, and like, that might even help you, right? Now you're like, I don't know. It's the job that pays me the most. Well, that's also still good, because then you can think about what are the things that help you earn that compensation. It may be like, oh man, like in order to do that, I need to be a senior staff or what have you. Don't go chase the title. Think about what are the competencies you need to get to that level. And you may realize, oh man, to get to senior staff, I need to build my social influence. And in order to do that, that means let me go work at a company where I get to practice that on a day-to-day basis, where I get to work with a leader who can coach me and teach me to do that on a day-to-day basis. And like, that's going to be very different from picking a company that says, hey, you know, Anand, welcome, we'll give you the title of senior staff. And then you're like, oh, cool, perfect, I got it.
Awesome. No, I loved it. Was almost like multiple life lessons packed into that answer or set of answers. So, I mean, I think as you talked about building your skill sets, a lot of them are driven by motivations, driven by what are they looking for. If someone happens to be a senior staff who wants to go and learn something, they have to be more influencing in their careers, etc. Now, we're talking about leadership and engineer leaders, and you mentioned you're hiring and you've been successful in that in their previous companies as well. What are some of the successful tips that you have for recruiting those strong leaders, because at the end of the day, the engineering leadership that you build, and not just the first line managers or the second line managers, really determines the path for how good engineers and what kind of engineering output you deliver for the organization. So I'd love to hear some of those tips as you go and recruit those strong leaders.
Yeah, so I can answer your question one of two different ways, and I'll try to cover both, but also not talk for too long. Is like,
Sure.
There's one part of like, how do you recruit and bring somebody on? The other is, how do you find the right person? Oftentimes people think about interviews as an opportunity to decide who is good or bad. Honestly, I don't think that's the right approach to doing that. Like, actually, there is value in figuring out who's good or bad. Like, there's that. But like, I think a large part of it oftentimes is a function of fit. And I've seen this so often, right? Like when and I'm sure a lot of folks here have probably seen this, is like you interview someone who was at a company who was super incredibly successful at that company, and they may fail your most basic interview question, and you're like, wow, what happened there? And you also have probably seen something along the lines of like someone was struggling at your company and they joined this other company, and all of a sudden they're crushing it at that company. And you're like, does this company have a low bar? Maybe, maybe not, right? More likely the case is that was a better fit for them. And so one of the things we look for here at Grand Rounds is when we interview folks is trying to find a fit on 3 dimensions. And I think these 3 dimensions are actually pretty accurate in the sense of, what are your values? Now, you can approach values in a variety of different ways. You can say, oh, I value ethics and I value honesty, transparency. Like, those are important. But what are you valuing in your next role? Are you valuing compensation more often than not? Are you valuing growth? What sort of growth are you valuing for? Are you valuing the mission? Because the value alignment is incredibly important, because if you think about a leader that you're bringing on, they're going to bring on other people like them in some ways. And also they're going to have to express the values of the company. You want to have that alignment, because with leadership, it is the moment you fake it, it's obvious. People have an incredibly amazing bullshit detector, and you can tell. And so the more you can have strong alignment on the values, the better. Now, the second 2 things are, what are your strengths and what are the areas you want to grow in? The strengths are probably very obvious, being like, but here what we look for is like, what are some things that you're top 10% at? And it's not like, oh, I'm really good at Java. Like, sure, but like, why are you good at Java? Oh, it's because I'm really good at problem solving. Why are you good at problem solving? Well, because, it's a natural ability, and like, this is why I see this. That's what I care about. Like, I don't, like, again, if you're good at Java, Python, Go, whatever, like, you'll learn, like you're smart. What I want to understand is, what are your strengths that have enabled you to be successful? And it might be like, look, I have a lot of grit, or I will go deep and understand those things. And like, it's important to understand that. And the third is, what do you want to grow into? And oftentimes people view that as like, what are your weaknesses? No, like, that's not what I'm looking for. Everyone has weaknesses, and there are things we're not good at. But what are the things that you have consciously decided are things that you want to get better at? And that's very different. It doesn't mean you're terrible at it, but it's something that you want to get good at. If you have an alignment on all 3, where the role lets you leverage your strengths in a meaningful way, it lets you get to practice the things that you want to get good at, and you have a strong alignment with the values, oh my gosh, the company's good. Like, this is going to be a great fit. Like, you're going to love it. I'm going to love it. Like, the team and everything's going to be awesome.
Amazing.
When you have 2 out of 3, you have people who go, yeah, that's fine, but if some other company comes out and it's better, I'll do it. And if it's 1 out of 3, you're just waiting for your next promo, you're waiting for your next compensation, waiting for your bonus or a project to ship, and then you're out of there. Like, this is terrible. And so from our side, if I have that 3, that's amazing. And to recruit great talent, the goal is to help them see that. And by the way, the opposite is, if I don't have that, I want to wave you off. And like, I sometimes when I talk to candidates, I'm like, look, I'm not trying to send you away. Like, actually, I want to bring you here, but only if it's the right thing for you. Because again, I think about this in context of what my role is as a manager. If at the end of your time at Grand Rounds, you don't walk out being like, wow, that was a great role for me, or this company was amazing, I have failed. And I want to make sure I understand that. So if you are able to say, is like, look, the thing for me, let's say you're a manager and you're like, look, the goal for me is to get to director. And if I can understand what are the gaps for you that you believe are the cases for being director, and like, again, it's like, you may believe something and I may see things differently, and like, we'll talk about it. But if I can give you a role that lets you practice those things, and if I can coach and mentor you to do that, and there's an opportunity, which I believe Grand Rounds has a lot of those, then it's going to be amazing. In the absence of that, like, if someone's like, look, I want to be the greatest game developer, like, this is not going to be the right place. And I can tell them how you build great products, how you think about those things. But at some point, I will also tell them, like, look, we're not a gaming company. I mean, you could tell by the name of the company itself, but like that's the other side of it. So that would be my way I think about it, and like the between the company and things like that, and like how we've attracted and approached talent as well.
Awesome. No, I personally feel like, I love coaching and mentoring myself. And so I was super excited by when you actually described the way in which you think about it, and also how Grand Rounds thinks about it, like in terms of hiring strong leaders, hiring people who are actually going and aligned with values, not just about the what, but more about the why. Because at the end of the day, it's more about, how you're aligned with values and how the actual focus on values is so much important. So definitely love that answer there. So I think it was my favorite question and answer so far. In addition to the discussion we've had so far, I'd love to sort of get into sort of giving back to the community and the team, because at the end of the day, mentorship is all about not just working with your team, but also giving back to them. So I'd love to hear, how do you do the best things for you, and how do you give back to your team and the community?
So when I think about this, right, like I think giving back to the team, I mean, honestly, that's my job, right? Like one of the things I think about, by the way, this is particularly interesting in tech, and I love tech for this. I have friends who are non-tech, and their relationship with their manager is very different. It feels more transactional. In the context of tech, it's the manager's job to help someone grow, and it's like a trust you build with the manager when you bring on, right? Like I guess you can approach it as a transaction, but the world has changed in the context of we don't work at the same job forever, right? Like, and there's a book by Reid Hoffman called The Startup of You, which talks about a lot of these things, and where you approach things from like, it's no longer it's now you have these things called tours of duty. And like you may say, this is my tour of duty to do X or Y. And so for me as a manager, like it's being honest about these things and making sure I set those things up. As far as giving back to the community, I mean, I'm on Plato. I'm a mentor on Plato as well. And so that's one way to do it. I've continued to keep in touch with a lot of my former reports and even my former managers as well, right? And in many ways, it's like, hey, how do we get in discussions? And like, this is one of the other ways I try to do that. I need to get a bit better at writing. I have a lot of pending blog posts that I've written like 3/4 of the way through that I need to sort of wordsmith and finish up. But I think those are some of the ways. Honestly, the best way though is if I can grow the next set of leaders within the company, where if they can do this better than me, that's even better, right? Like, and then that's like, hey, now I've had an ability to influence the world in a small way. Like it's like a piece of domino that I've sort of flicked. And Wade says this too in many ways, is like, he wants to build the next generation. And again, Wade has way more years of experience than I do. And so I'm not like, I want to influence the next generation, but I also want to increase my own personal impact along the same way as well.
Awesome. All right. I think we're getting to a bunch of different questions from the audience. Before we get into that, I'd like to just maybe get into the last question before we go into Q&A, if that's okay with you, Anand.
I'm good with it.
Yeah. So, first of all, I want to say that I'm super excited about our partnership, both Sunbird and Grand Rounds working together. Personally speaking, I've really loved this conversation, loved our partnership. And so, the last question I would ask is more about Sunbird and Grand Rounds. I mean, we're entering into this new era of the API economy. And as you see, the new businesses are being built by developers. And so as we look into this, what advice do you have for modern developers, especially as we build the new businesses which are powered by APIs?
Yeah. The world's changing so much is actually super interesting. Like if you think about the fact that you can get a data center on a cloud at a push of a button, that is insane. Like it just blows my mind. I remember back at LinkedIn, we had this project called Multicolo, which is moving from one data center to the other. Now the company is going to move to the cloud and stuff like that too. Again, it's super cool to think about. And so the thing I think about here is like every company will have to go through the journey of build versus buy. And that's a very fundamental but a deliberate question you have to go through. What I found more often than not is companies either have a not invented here syndrome, which is like, oh, we can always do better. And my approach here that I think about is anything I'm going to do should have a 3-to-1 ROI or something like that. And the reason I say that is because, look, I'm going to either underestimate the complexity or I'm going to overestimate my abilities. And so if you're able to say, like, look, I'm going to put in, and by the way, one of the lessons I learned at LinkedIn was like, my manager was like, treat your developer time as gold and don't mess that up. And that is something super true. And so if you believe that, look, you're going to get 3 to 4x the return on building something yourself, go do it. Like, that makes complete sense. But what I have found in a lot of cases is that's not necessarily true. For us, for example, even as an early stage startup, we are leveraging third-party tools to do a variety of things. And those are conscious calls rather than calls that are like random. And so my nudge to you as any leader in an organization that's thinking about these things is like, there's both sides of it. There's obviously like, look, we can totally build this. Or there's the, oh man, like there's something available off the shelf. Why would you ever think about doing it? Make sure that choice is deliberate. And as part of that, you think about some sort of heuristic by which you're doing it. I've personally applied a 3-to-1. And then the other thing is this going to be, is this something that we want to truly build expertise in, or is this something a means to an end? And so, like, for example, like you can build your own PagerDuty or like a messaging system or things like that. Or you can leverage something that helps you do that and like sort of accelerate your project growth and product trajectory. And so there's the other part. The last one, oftentimes, and this comes up even in the context of speed versus quality, where people are like, oh, should I do something that's quick and dirty, or should I build something with quality? And what I normally think about is like, why are you going for speed versus like, what's the urgency? If you're trying to move quickly because there's a lot of ambiguity and there's not a lot of clarity, go with speed, because honestly, you don't know if it's going to stick around. If you're trying to go for speed, but that's because you believe it's like, you genuinely believe it's the right thing, you just want to move quickly, then make sure you don't do speed at the expense of quality. And the honest answer is like, by the way, you always have to do both. I think as an engineer, the fun part is the trade-offs. You can ask someone to go build this something over 5 years, they'll do a great job at it. And you can ask someone to build this in a hacky way in 5 minutes, they could do like a decent job at it. It's when you have to do both. And so here, what you can think about is one of the ways you can sort of circumvent that is by leveraging third-party API tools in many ways, so that you can say, I can get quality and speed. And that again has to be a deliberate choice as you go through that.
Absolutely. No, that's so true. I mean, we see our customers share that with us almost on a regular basis, that they'd rather build with us than build it themselves. And of course, a lot of companies actually do a combination of both. So it's really a conscious choice. And as you said, it's a lot about heuristics in terms of what's right and what's not for them. So really taking that decision is interesting and important. Anand, I would say we've got 10 minutes. We've got a few questions here that we've got from the audience before we get in. I wanted to say, I really loved our conversation. I loved the life lessons. I loved the questions and the answers. And so once again, I appreciate it. So let me get into the questions here. The first question from the audience is from Andrew Sullivan. And it's, I wish I'd seen these questions as we were going through some of the questions that I was asking. So it's related to, how do you know when it's time to change companies?
Honestly, actually, what I can say is like, there are times when I look back at my career, there have been times where I'm like, oh, I should have left earlier. And so like I don't know if I have the perfect answer to that, but the way I think my nudge to you would be thinking about is like, are you growing in the ways that you want to grow? Are you getting the growth that you want? And like, by the way, that's like super ambiguous. And you can say it's like, no, I'm still learning, right? Like my team just got a new reorg done or things like that. The question there becomes is, are you getting incremental growth or are you getting dramatic growth, right? Like the truth is you can get incremental growth from switching things within the company. You can get incremental growth because your team just took on this big new project that you didn't think you'd get to do. You can get incremental growth because you just got reorged and all of a sudden you're working in this new domain and like, yeah, like I'm getting to learn stuff. That's cool. But what's the long-term plan to this, right? Like, what is the trajectory that you're aiming towards? Because yes, by the way, everything you do, you can get growth from, right? You can stay in your exact same role and you'll still get growth because there's something or the other that's new. But the question for me, I think about is like, what is the longer-term growth you're going for? If you were to fast forward a year from now, or 2 years from now, 3 years from now, pick a time frame. Would this be the best role for you? Would this be the thing that helps you get that success? I would also caveat this by the other side of this I've also seen is a level of impatience that comes through. I've had, like, for example, I had a manager who had been managing a team for 6 months at one point come in and say, hey, Anand, I'm ready to be a second line manager. I've been doing management for 6 months. I am really good at doing one-on-ones and project planning. I delivered a great project. I'm awesome. And like, I'm sort of paraphrasing a lot of these things, but that was basically the message. And that's very different, because the honest answer is like, there's a big difference between being able to do something and where you have mastery, where you're not only like, yes, given these situations, I'll be successful, but I have the breadth and depth of knowledge. And alongside of that is, once you have mastery, can you teach it? Because the thing is, like, oftentimes we sometimes instinctively know how to do things. We will be like, oh yeah, totally. Like, I mean, imagine with cooking. Like, I deal with this with my mother. I love my mom. Anytime I've asked her to teach me how to cook food, she's like, oh, just put a pinch of salt or pinch of whatever. And like, she just knows these things. It's very different from, can you teach me to figure those things out? My mom's a teacher, so she's incredible at these things. But anyway, so I'm going on a tangent. But my nudge to you would be to think about is like, are you getting the mastery that you are? And if you have already gotten it and you're growing in that regard, find something better. The other thing I would say is, if you find yourself questioning, why am I at this company? Or like, should I be thinking about leaving? There's probably something deeper as well to think about. Like, and this may tie into things like, do I not like the mission of the company? Do I not feel fulfilled by my role? Do I feel like I'm unfairly compensated? Do I feel like I don't trust my manager? I feel like I don't like my peers, or we're not getting along. Like, those are also very legitimate reasons. So I think I took my answer a little bit more in terms of growth is how I was interpreting, Andrew, your question. But there could be a lot of variety of other reasons where you may just be like, look, this company and its values don't align with me. So maybe the best way to answer your question is to think about it from the three values triangle. Do you feel like there's strong alignment in the values? Do you feel like there's strong alignment in the strengths of your leverage of your strengths? And do you feel like there's strong alignment in the areas that you want to grow into? And if you feel like that's the right spot for you or not.
I have to say, Anand, that was one of my favorite questions, and the answer that you provided, because it kind of provides a framework in terms of how you want to grow, where you want to go, etc. So that was awesome. We're getting to the next question. The next question is from Amin Jaipuri. And the question is, we see ourselves stuck in the rut and it almost seems impossible to get out. Not sure if I'm a great engineer or not, but I surely aspire to become an engineering lead. How do you get out of that rut?
So, I mean, by the way, there's a lot of times some of these things happen. Not even some of those things may not be even in your control. You may be working on a project that you were super excited about, but the business decided to kill it. And now all of a sudden you're like, man, like my path to being a strong tech lead went away because I was hoping these things would work out for me or whatnot. The question for me though is, if you think about it in the lens of, hey, I want to be an engineering lead, what does it take to be a great engineering lead? And that's, you may say, it's like, oh, to be a great engineering lead, I have to be a great engineer. I need to be great at cross-team collaboration. I need to be great at architecture. I need to be great at design. Whatever those things are for you, make sure you have a list of those things, and then evaluate and be honest with yourself. Like, where do you see yourself? Like, what is the thing that's causing you to be in the rut? And like, by the way, the natural tendency is to blame the outside world. Of saying is like, man, I'm not getting the cool projects that I want. My manager is really annoying. They don't let me do these things. Or, I'm just not getting the opportunities. Like my product manager doesn't have a good vision. By the way, those are also very legitimate things. Like, I'm not trying to say those are not true. But then think about it from a lens of like, is this all outside? How much of it's inside? Like, why are they doing these things? Because what I found is, like, as a manager, you're not out there to screw someone over. I have very rarely found managers who are like, I will go out of my way to mess this person up. More often what you see is a manager's like, look, I'm trying to help this person grow, but they're not getting it. And there's probably a disconnect there. So truly think about it from a lens of like, no, like, be honest. Like, I think that's the hard part. What I have found is usually it's one of three things that sort of kick through in, right? Like, the first one is more like you're just technical competence to doing this, like domain knowledge, like, can you do these things? And one of the things we see is like, you go from an Eng 1 to an Eng 2, your first year or second year of engineering. You're like, wow, I grew so much. Like, I was awesome. Like, I did not know how to commit code until now, and now I'm an expert in Git, right? Like, you go through that first set of journey. Over time, though, you see this tapering off, right? Like, the difference between someone who has 10 years of experience versus 11 years of experience, not as pronounced as someone who has 1 year experience versus 2 years of experience, right? And so at some point or another, your coding or cognizant abilities sort of slow down. Then is your your social abilities, right? Like, Is it, can you understand the situation? Can you understand the people around you? Can you read the room? And can you work through that? That's when you need to start figuring out how you build those things. And like early on in your career, you don't have to, but the more experienced you get, that's something that you need to get better at. Can you influence people in a way that achieves the right outcome for the business? And so you sort of hit and so the question would be like, where are you hitting the wall? Are you hitting the wall because you don't have the technical domain? Or are you hitting the wall in terms of your social and personal abilities? Like, are you self-aware? Can you control? Can you modulate? How well can you grow? So those would be some of the things I would think about. But honestly, it will have to come from a level of self-reflection. And at some point, like if you want to be an engineering lead, understand what the delta is and see if you're getting those practice opportunities to do so. Do you have a believable source? What are the ways you could do that?
Awesome. We've got 2 more minutes and I've got a few more questions that we'll run through, at least a couple here. Next one is from Sylvia Della Torre. It's kind of an interesting question. It says, have you ever faced or witnessed a situation in which you're seen as a strong competitor by the manager that reduced your options of growth?
So so there was once, well before, but the honest answer for me is, and as I read your question, it comes down to trust. Do you trust your manager or not? And if you don't trust your manager, that's the thing you have to look at. And at LinkedIn, we used to define trust as consistency over time. And that's one way to look at this, is like, has your manager been consistent with you on the things you're doing? But ultimately, it's a matter of how you define trust. I've thought about this in terms of competence and character. Like, is the person competent enough to do the things that they're saying? And do they have the right character that they will do that? If you don't see those things, like, I would encourage you to have that conversation, maybe even directly with your manager, and be like, hey, look, I don't feel like I have that growth trajectory. And ideally, that manager is honest with you. And even if they're sort of subconscious about it, they're direct with you. If not, do a skip level. That's one of the things. Like, if you're ever not getting along, talk to your manager's manager. Don't be like, oh man, this person's out there to screw me over. Talk to them more about like, hey, here's my career growth and aspirations. What do you think? Is this reasonable? What, like, is there a time frame to it? Ideally, you should have trust with your leadership. And if you don't have trust with your leadership, you should consider switching. David Henke at LinkedIn used to say something along the lines of 2 levels of bad management. If you have 2 layers of management that is bad, you're screwed. Your organization is screwed. And like, he's a very awesome person who used very colorful language. But that was the idea, is if you have 2 layers of bad management, you're done. And so, and by the way, I've seen that to happen so often, and it's very true. So my nudge to you is, hopefully you have 2 layers of good management where you have trust with both of them, if not at least one of the 2. Have that conversation and work through that there.
Awesome. Well, I have to say, Anand, this was such a pleasure. We are on time. We've got a few more questions, but I know we'll not run through them. But I appreciate you taking the time today. A huge thanks to the Plato team. And once again, thanks so much.